too much television, too much screen time, social media, video games, all of that stuff. And there's a thriving industry of people telling us how awful the modern world is for children. This is Sue Palmer. There's Jean Twenge, who's a psychologist in the US, who's produced a very successful article and book telling us how awful smartphones are. You know, you get lovely infographics here which give you the impression that's been done by somebody who knows what they're talking about. And then there's Susan Greenfield, who has lost it, I'm afraid. And that I'm very happy to go online about, take her on any time. She's not on Twitter, she doesn't believe in it. Absolutely evidence-free nonsense from her. And whenever I get people banging on about, I don't know how many of you have seen the South Park movie? I don't know. It's a bit like the mums in the South Park movie. It's for the children! When they've decided that everything Canadian is awful. And the children are going, no, it's fine, really, it's okay. And it's a lot like that. The kids are like, no, we're fine. I don't think it is due to, you know, this. It's just because things are really hard at the moment. And, you know, there's a lovely meme. What's wrong with you, said the older generation. The young people say, well, you've ruined the environment, the economy's gone to crap, you know, there's no housing, there's no jobs, and we feel under constant pressure to perform. It's the iPads, isn't it? You know, it's a moral panic, okay? We are in the grip of a moral panic. The difficulty with saying it's a moral panic and dismissing it is that eventually a moral panic will be right. And so we need to be just saying it's a moral panic is not enough of an argument. Okay. I'm interested in, this is Douglas Adams, obviously, who died far too young. He's been dead for a long time now. And he had a brilliant rule, and I'm trying to remember it correctly. If something is invented before you're 25, it's just part of the furniture. It's just there. If it's invented between 25 and when you're between 35 and 35, it's the amazing new thing. It's the future. And if it's invented when you're over 35, it is evil. And shouldn't be allowed. And it's not like it was when I were allowed. And it's a pretty good rule. I think I might have got one of the figures wrong. I'll look it up. But what a brilliant man to be making that sort of that sort of prediction. I wonder what he would have made of today. I think he would have made Douglas Adams. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yes, and many other brilliant things. Much missed. So, what is the evidence for a link between screen time and negative outcomes? There does appear to be a link with obesity. I mean, I think that sort of really expresses what the link is. It is probably true that you are less mindful when you are watching a screen, you're less mindful of the calories that you're taking in. We all know how easy it is to sit in front of a movie and realise that you've eaten a bucket of popcorn without really noticing. Whereas you would never sit down at a table and eat a bucket of popcorn. It would be gross. So I think that sort of tells you a lot of the story. There may be other effects, and it's certainly true that things like Wii Fit and all the kind of fitness screen time does not actually help. Although Pokemon Go, by getting you out of the house, actually, it is exercise, so that's at least something. Although I'm so 2017 by mentioning Pokemon Go. There will be something else this summer, which is virtual, augmented reality. Something will come out. They will be brewing it up now. So the kids will be out on their phones again. I'm kind of cool with that. Because here are some, I don't know how well they projected. Here are some, you don't have to worry about the figures, so I'll explain the figures. Here are some curves from a very, very good paper by Andy Shabilsky at the Institute, the Oxford Institute of Internet Institute. I think it's called something slightly different, but he's a really, really bright and good fellow Andy guy, and he has done this piece of work with some colleagues. Now, basically, this looks at daily hours of digital screen engagement. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's 7 hours of daily screen engagement. That is the TV and movies curve. Here is the video games curve. Okay, so this is no video games and your mental well-being with no video games. And here's your mental well-being with 7 hours of video games. So video games are not harmful. In fact, they're probably, if you only play a few, they're actually rather good for you, aren't they? For your mental well-being.
Sorry, what was the first graph?
So I'll go back to that, sorry. So,
Listening to parents.
sorry, what? Listening to parents. No. So the video game story is actually really, really positive. The non-dotted line is weekdays, so there is a bit of a drop-off mainly because if you're doing that many video games, you're not getting enough sleep. But at weekends, more or less fine. This is the curve when it comes to movies and TV, and this is the curve for smartphones, which is less good. When you start to get to 3 hours, you've got a significant decrease in well-being. That may not be due to the screens themselves, though, because all of the other screen-related activities seem fine. So, is it to do with what they're doing on their smartphones, and actually, is it a genuine finding?
Yeah, that was my question. Is it to do with whether they're interacting with something or
Yeah.
just watching something passive?
So, absolutely right. So one of the things that screen time researchers, and it's an extraordinary area because the first thing that a screen time researcher will tell you is we shouldn't be talking about screen time. We should be talking about what's happening on the screens. And another good person to read about this is Pete Etchells from Bath Spa University, and he talks about how the concept of screen time doesn't really make sense, and we should be thinking about, and this I think this makes the case rather well, that we should be thinking individually about activities rather than screen time overall. I left the image off here because it could be an upsetting image to you all, and I wanted to prepare you. It's an image from a story of domestic violence, theft, horrific violence, and misogyny. So I just want to get you ready for that. It's a horrible story, Punch and Cheeky, and it's been part of the culture for 300 years. Violent content is an absolute part of human history. From the Colosseum, to the mystery plays in the medieval age, even to Shakespeare. Violence has been part of public entertainment forever. And to cut a long story short, there isn't any evidence that somebody who plays violent video games is going to be more violent in their life. Though, of course, there was the tragedy of the Florida school shootings, and it is absolutely infuriating the number of Republican congressmen who've stood up and said, well, it's because you play violent video games. 97% of young people and adolescents play video games, and they all have a degree of violence about them. It's very rare to have somebody who plays no conflict-based video games. In fact, there are very few non-conflict-based video games apart from sport games. The vast majority are conflict-based, and actually it doesn't seem to have an effect. There is a surge of aggression in the immediate aftermath. We're talking about a few minutes to hours. It does appear that in lab conditions there's a surge, but if you look at the population, there doesn't seem to be an effect. Now, I'm not saying that therefore it's fine for a 6-year-old to play Grand Theft Auto. There's lots of reasons why that's not a good idea, but if you have, as a parent, looked at the certificate and you think it's probably appropriate for my child, there isn't any evidence that you're doing them harm by doing so. And it's certainly inappropriate. Let's say, for example, you have an 8-year-old who's playing Overwatch, which is a 12. You can tell I have an 8-year-old who plays Overwatch. And if the school was to say, well, I'm afraid the reason why he's violent is because he plays Overwatch, you can say, well, that isn't true. There isn't any science for that. You know, Grand Theft Auto is traumatic to actually play for a young child, so I think that's how it may have an effect. And I certainly, Call of Duty is the one that I really hate, but I hate that anyway as a consumer of video games because I think it's terrible. Anyway, so then there's the question, is there such thing as good screen time or bad screen time? And instinctively we sort of think, well, he's watching horrible histories, he's learning stuff, that should be fine. Whereas, have you ever seen these videos on YouTube? I mean, they are appalling nonsense. They're basically badly CGI'd versions of popular characters doing a succession of repetitive, meaningless things. These videos are generated algorithmically by computers. There is no human involved in producing these videos. And they are huge on the internet. They're huge on YouTube. They are completely without content. And they may have some violent content, although it's pretty mild by most standards. I don't think they're going to cause any harm. Horrible Histories, yes, will teach you stuff about Julius Caesar. Great, fine, brilliant. But the other thing about screens is that as well as the kind of moral panic, there's a kind of techno-utopian view of screens, that you can learn everything through a screen. That we should do all of our lessons through iPads. And actually there's very poor evidence for that too. And in education, I think there's both a kind of resistance to change, but also a bit of a cult of the new. And I think we need to be careful in both directions. You cannot learn a skill through television. You cannot learn language through television, which is why I think, particularly when children are struggling with their language, having TV on the background isn't a great idea, because it distracts them and it reduces the amount of interaction you can have. So in those specific situations, I think that you should be watching TV or not watching TV, and you shouldn't assume that they're learning anything that isn't just facts from TV. Do you see what I mean? It doesn't give you skills. It's not interactive enough. Now, there's theoretical reasons why I like an iPad. I don't know why I keep using iPads, I don't like them. An app might help you with particular skills. At the moment, there isn't evidence. Brain training does not work. Okay? We don't have evidence that it works. But it's fun, that's fine, carry on doing it. Just play games that are good. That's my only advice. Don't worry about games that are bad that seem to be good for you. So I don't focus when I'm talking about screen time to a parent, which I actually have to say, I don't bring up all that much because I know that the evidence isn't great. I don't want to focus on what they're doing, I want to focus on what they're not doing. So I ask a kid about what they like at home, and they almost always will say, I love playing on the iPad, and then the parent will say, but I only allow him 1 hour on Saturday. But I believe you, it's fine, but that's what he loves. And what does he do the rest of the time? And then you have this sort of thing, oh, we go to the park, I see my friends, and actually this stuff is really, really powerful and important. Getting outside, connecting with other people, sleeping, that is all really important, just as a general resilience, a general building of the child's well-being. So that is, the reason why screen time can be negative is an opportunity cost, essentially. Sleep is vital, and I'm sure have you had a talk about sleep and ADHD?
Yeah.
Oh, is Sally coming to do it?
She is.
Okay. She's good, but I'm biased. Sleep is very, very important, and Sally will cover it. Playing anything until 2 in the morning is not going to be good for you the next day. I mean, that's sort of common sense, but people don't seem to sort of realise that sometimes. So that's what I had to say about screen time. Any questions about screen time?
Well, I know you're saying the screen time is not a big issue, but okay, I don't have an issue with the screen time, but what happens when you take the screen time away?
Well, it's a frustrating thing to have your screen time removed, isn't it?
But even when you say no, after 2 hours, let's say you say, oh, okay, you're allowed to watch, for 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, and they end up, playing for 3 hours. So that, look, you had already 3 hours.
Okay.
And then, but as well, when they play, I don't know how your child play, but mine scream, cries, and it's not. I don't see any leisure from it. He's taking it.
No, but it's compelling, isn't it, for him?
No, he cries.
But does he want to do it?
Yes.
Exactly. So it's compelling. It's you know what I mean? It's like a bad girlfriend. It's compelling, but it hurts you.
I even asked, why do you want to do it? You cry because I died. I was like, oh, I didn't really die.
Exactly. I'm sort of. I suppose I'm trying to reassure you that you're not doing your child any harm by allowing them to do screen time.
But I see he's better without.
Yes.
He's so much
and
better,
I'm not
so
saying that that's wrong either. I mean, I saw a child yesterday, and the parents don't give him any screens because they can't, because he gets too excited. Yeah. And I had a computer on in my room, and they're right. They are absolutely right, and he has various difficulties, including ADHD. Yeah. So that's true. I'm not trying to affect your judgment as a parent about what's right. I think there are specific issues about. There are specific issues about boundaries and being consistent, and I'm not it's incredibly hard to do around screen time. But I think there's also specific issues that a lot of the games, there are particular save points where you can leave without losing progress, and it is really frustrating as a video gamer to have spent an hour on a level and then be told you have to stop it and lose all of your progress. I get that.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's like a computer crashing and you lose, the last hour of your work. That is really annoying. So my personal with my kids is to give them a very short period of time, and then at the end of that time say, right, where are you? Nearly finished this level. Okay, finish the level, then come on. And then they say, oh, I thought I would nearly finish, but actually, there's this mini one.
Yeah.
No. Go on.
Two things. One that we've found really helpful with our daughter with screen time is just to have her devices have a system where her device is shut off, so there's no Wi-Fi. And that seemed to work, so cut out a battle. So it wasn't us battling with it, it just meant that it went off, and she accepted that really, really well. So it just meant that she had half an hour, 20 minutes, or whatever it was, but that's the time it went off. The other thing that I'm really interested in is, has there been any research or anything done on any games or any use of screen that is beneficial for ADHD type children?
That's what the King's team are doing.
Like methylphenidate, instead of that they can use a stimulating. So it could be very stimulating for other children, but for an ADHD child, maybe quite calming.
So one of the King's things is using a computer game combined with the transcranial stimulation to see if that's a benefit.
Oh, okay.
I'm sceptical about the computer game because it looks a lot like a normal app, and the normal apps don't work, so I don't quite see how their computer game is going to work. Leave that one there. The difficulty I think you might have if you do a trial like that is for some kids it'll be brilliant, and some kids they'll go completely crazy, because what you'd have to do then is amp up the excitement level of a computer game. So for some kids that would be amazing, and they'd feel completely, kind of spent afterwards, and they'll feel great. And other kids will it'll really overstimulate them, and they'll get really difficult. So I think it'd be very hard to get a group effect in that bit of research.
Has there been any done?
No, I don't. I'm not aware of specific ones, but I think that if you talk to a psychologist about it, I think they would think that there's such variability in the response within the group that I think they would be sceptical that they would get a kind of significant effect.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is my final bit. I really don't need to spend much time on this, and this is really about I want to just put this in to say this is why I don't run a ADHD clinic.
It's too hard. It's too challenging for you.
Really? Okay. Thank you.
That's a joke.
I know. So these are the principles that I think are really important, and you can disagree, absolutely. So the needs of the child precede the diagnosis. The child, almost by definition, will have had needs related to his or her ADHD, for years before diagnosis. I mean, by definition, it's 6 months, but effectively, it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 years. Okay. So needs. So therefore, intervention should precede diagnosis. There should be support before diagnosis. So therefore, it should not be dependent on a diagnosis to get any support. There may be some forms of support which are dependent on diagnosis. Diagnosis, where appropriate, should be timely, as a point has been made earlier. And assessment should, but the where appropriate is important, and I don't think we should be blasé about the dangers of overdiagnosis. An assessment should be holistic and comprehensive. So simply going to a clinic that says you have ADHD, you don't have ADHD, which is the discussion we've been having, isn't necessarily satisfying. Going to a clinic which says either yes, no to autism may leave you with other things, kind of unsatisfactory. It's like it's eating prawn crackers. It's tasty, but you're not quite satisfied. That's not a great analogy. Let's never think up analogies on the fly, Max. So this is what I want to happen in Lambeth. The child develops difficulties, and there is in place basic interventions and support in school, and the families can access, if they need to, a generic parenting class if they feel that they are, they have the needs that require that, or they can, look up things for a child who's A quick plug, there is a website, Minded, have you heard of that? So Minded has a section for families, and Peter Hill, I think, wrote the section not on ADHD but on the hyperactive child. So there's no reason for you to have an ADHD diagnosis to go to that thing and read the wisdom of Peter Hill. You don't need to have a diagnosis. And it's a very good bit of e-learning for parents. So that's something that's the sort of thing that should be in place. And if you then have ongoing difficulties, there should be an assessment of needs, and I've put that before diagnosis of ADHD. The assessment of needs should be first. Now, whether we're good enough at it or not, I don't know. We're probably not. I'm wary that there's at least one person who's been through the process. I might not agree that we actually achieve any of this. And then after that, you should have specialist intervention support and possible medication. So medication is at the end of that journey. Not even the end of that journey, but it's towards the back of that journey. What are the pitfalls? So the pitfalls, so it's tempting to say, oh well, what we should do then is all the schools should have an ADHD policy, and we should have an ADHD clinic which will pick up all of these children. And it should be a dedicated ADHD clinic, and before when the child gets referred, the school or the GP should send in all the Connors questionnaires so that we can have a one-stop shop so that when you arrive you get a diagnosis. Does that sound attractive? No. So a lot of people are saying no, because that's good. It's a good thing to say no, because I don't think it's attractive either. And the first thing is confirmation bias. I love this comic because it basically reflects what the internet is like, but it's also a reflection of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is one of the most dangerous cognitive biases in psychology generally. What it means is you see what you're expecting to see. Do you think doctors are more or less prone to cognitive bias, to confirmation bias, or the same, than the general population? Who thinks they're less prone to confirmation bias?
Less.
Yes. Are doctors less? Well, no, do you actually think we are less prone to confirmation bias?
No, it's the same.
Do you think? Who thinks that doctors are more prone to confirmation bias? Thank you. The lawyer. Who thinks that doctors are exactly as prone to confirmation bias as the general population? Clue, put your hand up now, because that's the right answer. We're exactly as prone to confirmation bias as you, sitting across from us. There's nothing about medical training that prevents you from having confirmation bias. Partly that's because medical training is not good enough at critical thinking, but that's another thing. So why is overdiagnosis a bad thing? So I'm just going to put up a map of the USA. Can you have a guess at what the different shadings are?
Yes.
ADHD diagnosis?
Yeah, levels of ADHD diagnosis. There's two things about this map that are important. One is that the whole thing is higher than the UK levels of diagnosis. Now, the important thing, and I'm very happy to send out an article explaining this in detail, but there is no such thing as a true prevalence of ADHD. There's no right prevalence. In the UK, we use a relatively restricted definition of ADHD because the wider you get with the ADHD, the more children you're exposing to medication. And if you just treat the ones who are absolutely in the diagnostic category, then you're more likely to have, I think, a good cost-benefit analysis. The benefit harms analysis. And the second reason is schools are bad enough at treating ADHD seriously. If we suddenly increase tenfold the number of children we're diagnosing, they'll stop paying any attention to it at all. Because not everyone's got ADHD, it's just normal. And they'll stop caring at all about it. And the other thing, of course, that's really interesting about this map is the variation. So here's Texas, which is, I've only got ranges, but that's under 8%. And here's Louisiana. I have looked this up, so don't worry, I'm not. Here's Louisiana, which is over 15%. So why is the difference? Why is there a difference between just over the border, Texas and Louisiana?
Space?
No. No, because you've got North Dakota up here. See, I did know. North Dakota up here, which has got the lowest population density of any of the states in the United
Is it
States.
because of the number of staff that are available to diagnose?
Nope.
Policy.
Policy. It's about educational policy. That's what it's thought to be. I mean, we're not sure, but the educational policy in Louisiana is very different to Texas because it's a federation of states, and so therefore, even though the population is broadly similar, although there are differences, there's a much higher level of diagnosis because you require a diagnosis to get any support in schools in Louisiana. So it's just an interesting illustration. And people might disagree with my analysis of that, which is fine, but it's such a stark difference across a single border. There's something going on. The other problem, I think, with having a dedicated ADHD service is this thing called clinic pinball, where someone will come to you and go, you know, he's kind of ADHD-ish, but he's also got a bit of autism about him, hasn't he? And he's a bit dyspraxic, so let's send him to CAM, because they do. Now let's send him up to paediatrics, to the autism clinic, and see if he's got autism. And then the autism clinic see the child, and they go, yeah, he's a bit autistic, but he's also got quite a lot of ADHD about him. Let's send, no, actually, maybe he's a bit sensory. Let's send him to the OTs. And it goes round and round and round and round. It's a familiar story, isn't it? And you get this. I mean, one of the big one is shuttling between CAMS if they do ADHD and paediatrics if they do autism. So you get children sent to CAMS because someone thinks they've got ADHD. CAMS take one look at them and think, it's a bit autistic. Send them to, often before they've even seen the child, send it to paediatrics. And paediatrics can't do the full assessment because they don't have sufficient skills in ADHD. So that's why another really, probably, maybe for you, more compelling reason why we can't have this situation where everyone just looks at one diagnosis. So this is our highly imperfect and bodged together, held together with string solution that I have kind of developed. So advice and support to schools is not dependent on diagnosis. We're fairly lucky, I mean it's not perfect, but we're fairly lucky to have a proactive educational psychology department who've recently produced guidance for schools on the Lambeth School Services website, which is very practical, not dependent on diagnosis, and they can start accessing as soon as they have difficulties with a child who's having problems with attention. We're trying to raise the profile with the local authority. The remark I made earlier about, they said, how many have you got? We don't know. So that's the sort of thing. It's part of a broader behavioural strategy around early intervention and actually getting a decent specialist provision around this sort of thing that isn't approved and isn't a one-way street. That is a big problem, and we're not there. Having a parent group is wonderful. And I think it's so great to come to this place, and it's great to go and talk to the guys in our parent group because partly they're a fantastic source of energy, partly they're a really good source of challenge. They'll tell us, they'll sort of go, well, what's this? Where are you going with this, and where is this happening? Why isn't this happening? And I believe a lot of the sort of progress we've made would not have happened without our parent group. And I'm sure Michelle will watch this video and publicly thank her for her work, and the rest of the guys and all of that. So we're going to hopefully work closely with them, and I'll point out one really exciting thing we're going to try and do. But what I run, this is my bit, is a one-stop developmental assessment service. So we try to cover, in an hour and a half, communication, behaviour, motor, sensory, cognitive skills, but also the background, the hinterland of the child, the previous problems with abuse, the difficulties within the family, lots of kids coming in with histories of domestic violence, histories of particularly mothers with physical problems. It's very interesting how challenging that seems to be when you have when you have a hyperactive child, having physical disability yourself seems to be an absolute toxic mix, actually, and these are very difficult cases. Diagnosis, we don't necessarily give a diagnosis after the initial assessment partly because I want people to go away with an understanding of how brilliant their child is, but also the challenges, which is not necessarily trammeled by a specific diagnosis, and they're taking in the fact that we have this idea of the child of how they are and why they are how they are, before we then make them process the fact there's a diagnosis. Does that make sense? So we're not trying to we're also trying to prevent confirmation bias, but we're not trying to introduce delay, it's just that that's how most people seem to like to process this information. Further information is then sought, particularly from schools, and it's absolutely essential that schools some information is sought from a third party. And if you've got a diagnosis and there's no third party information, that is dodgy, as far as I'm concerned. So we go and seek the information and have a conversation with schools. usually, and then at follow-up we'll give diagnosis, we'll explain the diagnosis, begin the psychoeducation, which is a really posh word, isn't it, for just explaining and reassuring and being nice, I suppose, is one of the main things. And we do refer them to the ADHD follow-up clinic, which does exist and is in CAMS. So that's a problem we have, that at that point, that really crucial point for families, we have to put them through a transition to a totally different organisation. And I'm not satisfied by that. Unfortunately, CAMS have a long waiting list. Fortunately, that's allowed me to argue with my trust that I need to see them twice before they transition. So I see them, and then I see them while they're waiting for CAMS, and then they go. Anyway, I'm still going to get in trouble for that eventually. And then, we will support them during the period when they're still with us with liaison. It's a lot of conversations, a lot of chatting about this and that, trying to support the child in a way that's very hard to capture in terms of commissioning and in terms of outcomes, but I think it's possibly the most important part of my role. There are ongoing barriers, and just like you guys have been saying, there's a lack of understanding which is still clinging to parts of the system. I mean, my educational psychology colleagues are lovely and they're very supportive. I'm not completely sure they believe in the diagnosis, but because they want to support me, they're helping. So there's a lot of, and there's social workers who are very challenging when a child is on a child protection plan or there's some sort of domestic violence. Will fight tooth and nail to prevent a diagnosis of ADHD. So that's very frustrating and difficult. The commissioning is very fragmented. What's really struck me isn't that the commissioners don't want it to be integrated. Nobody needs to be convinced that integrated commissioning is a good idea. It's just getting it done. There aren't that many commissioners around. There's a very small group, and it's a huge effort to get these massive organisations to come together in one thing, in one cause. It's a huge effort, and we're not getting there as fast as we should do. Then, of course, there's money. We don't get a single penny for ADHD. We get none. We do it because it's the right thing to do, and also because it's meaningless to do a developmental assessment if you're not able to identify ADHD. That's my view. But the money to follow that view has not been forthcoming in 9 years in the job so far. Nearly 9 years. And there's time. So time, of course, is money. But I think one of the things that people complain about, and I understand that complaint, is that they feel rushed through the health process. And it's kind of inevitable. And it's sort of, how can we unlock time in the system, talking to other people, talking to other families, talking to us, communicating with us in a way that isn't this incredibly time pressured. You're half an hour in, someone says, next patient's here, and you feel under pressure to wrap it up and go on. How do we make people, even if we haven't got the time, how do we make people feel that we have time for them? Do you see what I mean? But there is also good news. There's a future direction. The brilliant parent, Maggie, one of our parents in Lambeth, has the proposal to basically set up a new support service. There's similar to a group that's been running for a few years in Harrow. We're going to work alongside peer supporters, we're going to have voluntary sector involvement from the beginning, local authority links, and me and the CAMS people co-producing, sharing leadership with the parent group. That's the idea, that's the exciting vision, but if I'm honest, it's been very difficult to get beyond, yes, we all want to do this, to getting things off the ground. But we'll work at it, and that's what we're trying to do.